Test, test, test. Test, test, test.
All right. Nice, nice. All right. Let me switch to desktop mode. All right. Let me switch to desktop mode. All right. Let me switch to desktop mode. Boo, boo, boo. All right. Seems to be working. Boo, boo, boo. All right. Seems to be working. Boo, boo, boo. All right. Seems to be working. Bum, bum, bum. Do, do, do. All right. Looks like the sound's working. Video's up. All right. Looks like the sound's working. Video's up. Do, do, do. Do, do, do. All right. Think I got it working. There we go. All right. So we have pushed on. We've gotten through over half now. So we have pushed on. We've gotten through over half now. Why is it re-echoing? Something is playing through speaker. But yeah, we are over half now. We've gotten almost through halfway on the Federalist Papers. Hamilton and Mr. Madison. I think today we are going through the defense of the House of Representatives. This was when, right after the Revolution, the Articles of Confederation have totally bounced, and they're not working anymore. People aren't liking it. The Articles of Confederation have been an utter failure. So they've written the Constitution. The Constitutional Convention has happened. So now they're going to go and they're going to try to get all the states to ratify it. And the way Madison and Hamilton did it, big contributors to the Constitution, they're going out and they're writing pamphlets. They're called the Federalist Papers. And he's going, all right, come on, states, we need to ratify this Constitution. The Articles of Confederation have been an absolute failure. We need to get this going. So they wrote like 80 something of these until the Constitution was actually ratified. And so now we're on number 56, and in this one they're going to defend the House of Representatives. Usually how it goes is they'll find like a contention, one of the common contentions with the Constitution, and they'll make a Federalist Papers in rebuttal of the complaints against it. All right. But this is number 56, House of Representatives. The total number of House of Representatives, this was a big sense of... He didn't rude? Yeah, so this is a big defense on the... Rude? What I do was rude. Oh. I'm not sure what I did. But all right. No Hamilton. I'm pretty sure this one was Madison. But all right. Oh, the total number of in the House of Representatives. So this is a big contention. A lot of the small states were complaining that the big states were getting too much representation, and the big states were complaining they weren't getting enough representation. So the second charge against the House of Representatives is that it will be too small to possess a due knowledge of the interest of the constituents, as this objection evidently proceeds from the comparison to the proposed number of representatives with great extent to the United States. I think at this time, oh, I get it now. Okay, I see. He didn't just read, he wrote a bunch of stuff. He didn't just sing, he also wrote a bunch of stuff. Yeah, so I think at this time it was like 30,000 people per representative. So, they're good now. Like, I think it's way insane after that. 700,000, and people were complaining back then that 30,000, one representative per 30,000 was not nearly enough. They needed way more representation, and now it's one per 700,000, which is just absolutely crazy. Over like 25% more. The number of their inhabitants and the diversity of their interest, without taking into view at the same time circumstances which will distinguish Congress from the other legislative bodies. The best answer that can be given to it will be a brief explanation of these peculiar, oh man, I can't say that word. It's peculiar. A tease. It is sound and important principle that the representative ought to be acquainted with the interest and circumstances of his constituents, but this principle can extend no further than those circumstances and interests to which the authority and care of the representatives relate. Yeah, 700. I don't know. I'm a big advocate that there needs to be way more representatives in Congress. It is way too small. I don't know what the insane number would be. I think if we did today, we'd have like close to 1,000 representatives in the House of Representatives if it was the same like ratio. But we need more than what we have, because one per 700,000, that's almost like senator level. An ignorance of variety of minute and particular objects which do not lie within the compass of legislation. It is consistent with every attribute necessary to a due performance of the legislative trust. In determining the extent of information required in the exercise of particular authority, recourse and then must be had to the objects within the purview of that authority. What are to be the objects of federal legislation? Those which are of most importance and which seem to be the most require local knowledge are commerce, taxation, and the militia. A proper regulation of commerce requires much information, as has elsewhere been remarked, but as far as this information relates to the laws and local situations of each individual state, a very few representatives would be sufficient vehicles of its federal councils. All right, so as long as the representatives understand the economy of their local districts, that's like, you only need so much information to govern these people, this amount of people. So that's his first argument. You don't need like the minutia of like knowing every business there. You just need to know how it mostly works within your area. Taxation will consist in a great measure of duties which will be involved in the regulation of commerce. So far, the preceding remark is applicable to this object, as far as it may consist of internal collections. A more diffusive knowledge of the circumstances of the state may be necessary, but will not also be possessed in sufficient degree by a very few intelligent men, diffusely elected within the state. Divide the largest state into 10 or 12 districts, and it will be found that there is no peculiar local interest in either, which will not be within the knowledge of representatives in the district. Besides this source of information, the laws of the state, framed by representatives from every part of it, will be almost of themselves a sufficient guide. In every state that have been made, and must continue to be made, regulations on the subject, which will be, in many cases, leave little more to be done by the federal legislature. than to review the different laws, reduce them in one general act. A skillful individual in his closet with the local codes before him might compile a law of some subjects of taxation for the whole Union without any aid from oral information, and it may be expected that whenever internal taxes may be necessary, and particularly in the case requiring uniformity throughout the states, the more simple objects will be preferred. To be fully sensible of the facility which will be given to this branch of federal legislation by the assistance of state codes, we only need to suppose for a moment that this or any other state were divided into a number of parts, each exercising within itself the power of local legislation. All right, so he's saying that we already have the state legislative, the state representatives, so we can use that knowledge for the making of laws of commerce and taxation. We don't need to have the minute detail. That's what the state governments are for. Is it not evident that the degree of local information and preparatory labor would be found in the several volumes of their proceedings, which would very much shorten the labors of general legislation, and render a much smaller number of members sufficient for it? The federal councils will derive a great advantage from other circumstances. The representatives of each state shall not only bring with them considerable knowledge of its laws and local knowledge of their respective districts, but will probably in all cases have been members, and even at the very time be members, of state legislature, where all local information interests of the state are assembled, and from whereas they easily conveyed the very few hands of the legislator of the United States. All right, so we have the state governments. They probably worked in the state governments. They have knowledge of the states already. We don't need 1,000 people to represent this knowledge in the federal government. There's we go into that. The observation made on the subject of taxation apply with greater force of the case of the militia. For however different the rules of discipline may be in different states, they are the same throughout each particular state, and depend on circumstances which can differ but little in different parts of the same state. The attentive reader will discern that the reasoning here used to prove sufficiency of moderate number of representatives does not in any respect contradict with what urged on another occasion with regard to the extensive information which the representatives ought to possess, and the time that might be necessary of acquiring it. This information, so far as to relate to the local objects, is rendered necessary and difficult, not by a difference of laws of local circumstances within a single state, but those of among the different states. All right, so you don't need, so if the representatives from New York, you don't need a representative from New York and the Bronx and Buffalo to tell you how the militia in that state or each of those cities work, because all the militia in that state work under the same guidelines. So one representative would know the knowledge of the whole state for that. Okay. Taking each state by itself, its laws are the same, and its interests but little diversified. A few men, therefore, will possess all the knowledge requisite for a proper representation of them, where the interest and affairs of each individual state perfectly simple and uniform. A knowledge of them in one part would involve the knowledge of them in every other, and the whole state might be completely represented by a single member taken from any part of it. I don't know if I'm completely convinced with him on that one. Representing New York City versus Buffalo, these are very different representatives of them. But of his point here, it's overall correct. On a comparison of the different states together, we find a great dissimilarity in their laws, and many other circumstances connected with the objects of federal legislation, with all of which the federal representatives ought to have some acquaintance. While a few representatives, therefore, from each state may bring with them due knowledge of their own state, every representative will have much information to acquire concerning all the other states. The charges of time, as was formerly remarked on the comparative situation of the different states, we have an assimilating effect. The effect of time on internal affairs of the states, taken singly, will be just to the contrary. At the present, some of the states are little more than a society of husbandmen. This is an old-timey term. I don't know what husbandmen. an archaic term for a farmer, tiller of the soil, someone who manages and cultivates the land. A yeoman in historical English society. Okay, so most of the society are farmers. They're working the land. So, we don't need. So the farmer in, northern Pennsylvania and southern Pennsylvania are going to have pretty similar interest. So we don't need 1,000 they don't each need their own representative to represent this interest. Few of them have made much progress in the branches of industry which give a variety and complexity to the affairs of the nation. These, however, will in all of them be the fruits of a more advanced population, and will require on the part of each state a fuller representation. The foresight of the convention has accordingly taken care that the progress of population may be accompanied by a proper increase in the representatives in the branch of government. And he's like, all right, I know the population is going to grow. People are going to change. We have a system built in to expand the representatives of the branch. The experience of Great Britain, which presents to mankind so many political lessons, both in the monetary and exemplary kind, which has been frequently consulted in the courts of these inquiries, corroborates the result of the reflections which we have just made. The number of inhabitants in the two kingdoms, England and Scotland, cannot be stated less than 8 million. The representatives of these 8 million in the House of Commons amount to 558. Of this number, 1/9 are elected by 364 persons, and 1/2 by 5,723 persons. Subsection 1. It cannot be supposed that the half thus elected who have not even resided among the people at large can add anything either to the security of the people against the government or the knowledge of their circumstances and interest in the legislative councils. On the contrary, it is notorious that they are more frequently the representatives and instruments of the executive magistrate, and that the guardians and advocates of the popular rights. They might, therefore, with great propriety be considered as something more than a mere deduction from the real representatives of the nation. We will, however, consider them in this light alone, and will not extend the deduction to considerable number of others who do not reside among their constituents, are very faintly connected with them, and have very little particular knowledge of their affairs. With all these concessions, 279 persons only will be the depository of the safety, interest, and happiness of 8 millions. That is to say, there will be one representative only to maintain the rights in a situation of 28,670 constituents. He's really complaining about this, but that's way less than our representation per person now. In an assembly exposed to the whole force of the executive influence and extending its authority to every object of legislation within the nation whose affairs are the highest degree diversified and complicated, it is very certain that not only the valuable portion of freedom has been preserved under all these circumstances, that the defects in the British Code are chargeable in a very small proportion. On the ignorance of the legislature concerning the circumstance of the people, allowing to this case the weight which it is due to it, and comparing it with the House of Representatives as above explained, it seems to give the fullest assurance the representative for 30,000 inhabitants will render the latter both safe and competent guardian on the interest which it is to be confided to. Publius. All right. That's number 56. That's actually a short one. He's usually, especially Madison, he's a lot more long-winded. He likes to go. All right, number 57. The alleged tendency of the new plan to elevate the few at the expense of the many, considered in the connection with the representation. All right, the tendency of the new plan to elevate the few. So probably talking about, this is probably a complaint coming from the small states that he's going to address. The third charge against the House of Representatives is that it will be taken from the class of citizens which will have the least sympathy with the mass of the people, but be most likely to aim and ambitious sacrifice of the many to the aggrandizement of the few. Of all the objects which have been framed against the federal constitution, this perhaps is the most extraordinary. Whilst the objection itself is leveled against the pretended oligarchy, the principle of it strikes at the very root of republican government, little r Republican, by the way. I have to say that because people have complained. The aim of every political constitution is, or ought to be, first to obtain for rulers men who possess the most wisdom to discern and the most virtue to pursue the common good of society, and in the next place to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous while they continue to hold the public trust, to elevate the mode of obtaining rulers in the characteristic policy of little r republican government. This means relied on in the form of government preventing their degeneracy and numerous and various. The most effectual one is a limitation on the term of appointments, and will remain a proper responsibility to the people. Let me now ask, what circumstance there is for the constitution of the House of Representatives that violates the principles of little r republican government, or favors the elevation of the few on the ruin of the many? Let me ask, whatever every circumstance is, not on the contrary, strictly principles, and scrupulously impartial to the rights and pretensions of every class and description of citizens. Oh, what happened? Said I disconnected. Am I back? I think I'm back. It's acting like I'm back. I'm just going to assume that I'm back. The timer's going. Alright. If anybody's there, throw a like or something so I can see at least. I want to beg for likes, but I don't even know if I'm here. Oh. Let me just pause it and then. Okay. I'm assuming I'm back. It seems to be working. Okay. All right, who was it? All right, defending the House of Representatives. Who are the electors of the federal representatives? Not the rich, more than the poor, not the learned, more than the ignorant, not the haughty heirs of distinguished names, more the humble sons of obscurity and unpretentious fortune. The electors are to be the great body of the people of the United States. They are the same who exercise the right in every state of electing the corresponding branch of the legislature of the state, who are the objects of the popular choice. Every citizen whose merit may recommend them to the esteem and confidence of his country. No qualifications of wealth, birth, religious faith, or civil profession is permitted to fetter the judgment or disappoint the inclination of the people. If we consider the situation of men on whom the free suffrages of their fellow citizens may confer the representatives' trust, we shall find it involving every security which can be devised or desired for the fealty of their constituents. In the first place, as has been distinguished by the preference of their fellow citizens, we are to presume that they will be somewhat distinguished also by those qualities which entitle them to it, and which premise of sincere and scrupulous regard to the nature of their engagements. In the second place, they will enter into public service under the circumstances which cannot fail to produce a temporary affection at least to their constituents. There is in every breast a sensibility to marks of honor, of favor, of esteem, and of confidence, which, apart from all considerations of interest, is the same pledge for grateful and benevolent returns. All right, so I think he's being a little rose-tinted glasses there, but, you know, he's living in a rose-tinted time. Ingratitude is a common topic of declamation against human nature, and it must be confessed that instances of it are but too frequent and flagrant, both in public and in private life. but the universal and extreme indignation which it inspires itself a proof of the energy and prevalence of the contrary sentiment. In the third place, those ties which bind the representatives to his constituents are strengthened by motives of mere selfish nature. His pride and vanity attach him to a form of government which favors his pretension and gives him a share in its honors and distinctions. Whatever hopes or projects might be entertained by a few aspiring characters, it must generally happen that the great proportion of men deriving their advancement from the influence with the people would have more to hope from a preservation of the favor, more than the innovations of the government subversive to the authority of the people. All these securities, however, would be found very insufficient without the restraint of frequent elections. Hence, in the fourth place, the House of Representatives is so constituted as to support in the members the habitual recollection of the dependence of the people. All right, so there's a big defense against corruption in the House of Representatives by these frequent elections, which he kind of went over earlier. He's like, we will have, bad people, we'll have bad representatives, but there's always another election coming. And I think this is a good point, except for I don't think he realized just how divisive some representatives would be and how people just don't care about people being horrible people. And then they're like, oh, he thought this was a huge defense. Like, oh, somebody being horrible, we'll get them out of there. The people won't stand for that. And I think he underestimated how much the people will put up with. Before the sentiments impressed on their minds by the moral or by the mode of the elevation can be affected by the exercise of power, they will be compelled to anticipate the moment when their power is to cease, when their exercise of it is to be reviewed, and when they must descend to the level from which they are raised. They are forever to remain unless a fateful discharge of their trust shall have established their title to renewal of it. I will add, as a fifth circumstance in this situation of the House of Representatives, restraining them from the oppressive measures, that they can make no law which will not have its full operation of themselves and their friends, as well as on the great mass of the society. This has always been deemed one of the strongest bonds which human policy can connect the rulers and the people together. It creates between them the communion of interest, sympathies, sentiments of which few governments have furnished examples, but without which every government degenerates into tyranny. If it be asked, what is to restrain the House of Representatives from making legal discriminations in favor of themselves and particular class of society? I answer, the genius of the whole system, the nature of just and constitutional laws, and above all, the vigilant and manly spirit which actuates the people of America, the spirit which nourishes freedom and in return nourishes by it. If the spirit shall ever be so far debased as to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislator as well as on the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. Such will be the relation between the House of Representatives and their constituents, duty, gratitude, interest, ambition itself, and the cords by which they are bound to fealty and sympathy with the great mass of the people. All right, so that's a pretty strong statement. So if the spirit shall ever be so far debased to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislature, so if the president starts making laws on himself, the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. That's pretty strong words for Mr. Madison there. It is possible that these may all be insufficient to control the caprice and wickedness of man, but they are not all the government will admit, and that the human prudence can devise. Are they not genuine in the characteristic means by which the Republican government provides for the liberty and happiness of the people? Are they not identical means on which every state government in the Union relies for the attainment of these important ends? What then are we to understand by the objection which this paper has combated? What are we to say to the men who profess that the most flaming zeal for little r Republican government, but boldly impeach the fundamental principle of it? Who pretend to be champions for the right and capacity of the people to choose their own rulers, yet maintain that they will prefer those who will immediately and infallibly betray the trust committed to them? Were the objections to be read by one who has not seen the mode prescribed by the Constitution for the choice of representatives, he should suppose nothing less than that of unreasonable qualifications of property was annexed to the right of suffrage, or to the right of eligibility was limited to persons of particular families or fortunes, or at least the mode of prescribed in the state constitutions, was in some respect or other very grossly departed from. All right, so he's saying like all these people, they have all these attacks on the Constitution, on the House of Representatives, and he's like, okay, I don't believe that you want democracy. I don't think you want a republic. I don't believe you. If you attack this fundamental idea of representative government, then you don't actually want what you're saying that you want. We have seen how far such supposition would err as to the two first points, nor would it, in fact, be less erroneous as to the last. The only difference discoverable between the two cases is that each representative of the United States will be elected by 5,000 or 6,000 citizens. Try 100 times that, but we get the point. Whilst in the individual states, the election of representatives is left to about as many hundreds. Will it pretend that this difference is sufficient to justify an attachment to the state governments and an abhorrence to the federal government? If this is the point on which the objection turns, it deserves to be examined. It is supported by reason. This cannot be said without maintaining that 5,000 or 6,000 citizens are less capable of choosing fit representatives or more liable to corruption by an unfit one than 500 or 600. Reason, on the contrary, assure us that as it is so great a number, a fit representative would be most likely to be found. So the choice would be less likely to be diverted from him by the intrigues of the ambitious or the bribes of the rich. Is it coincidence from this doctrine admissible? All right, let me try that again. Is the conscious from this doctrine admissible? I totally read that completely wrong. If we say that 500 or 600 citizens are as many can jointly exercise the rights of suffrage, would we not deprive the people of immediate choice of their public servants in every instance where the administration of government does not require as many of them as will amount to one for that number of citizens? Is the doctrine warranted by facts? It is shown in the last paper that the real representative in the British House of Commons has very little exceed the proportion for one for every 30,000 inhabitants, besides a variety of powerful causes not existing here, but which favor of the country, the pretensions of rank and wealth. No person is eligible as a representative of a country unless he possesses a real estate of clear value of £600 sterling per year, nor a city or borough unless he possesses a like estate of half that annual value. To this qualification on the part of the country representatives is added another part of the country electors, which restrains the rights of suffrage to persons having freehold estates of the annual value of more than £20 sterling, according to the present rate of money. Notwithstanding these unfavorable circumstances, and notwithstanding some unequal laws in the British Code, it cannot be said that the representatives of the nation have elevated the few on the ruins of the many. But we need not to resort to foreign experience on this subject. Our own explicit and divisive, the districts of New Hampshire, in which the senators are chosen immediately by the people, are nearly as large as will be necessary for her representatives in Congress. Those of Massachusetts are larger than be necessary for that purpose, and those of New York are still more so. In the last state of the members of assembly for the cities and counties of New York and Albany are elected by nearly as many voters as will be entitled to representative in Congress. calculating on the number of 65 representatives only, it makes no difference that these senatorial districts and counties, a number of representatives are voted for by each elector at the same time. If the same electors are at the same time are capable of choosing 4 or 5 representatives, they cannot be incapable of choosing one. Pennsylvania is an additional example. Some of her counties, which elect her state representatives, are almost as large as her districts will be, by which her federal representatives will be elected. The city of Philadelphia is supposed to contain 50 and 56,000 souls. It will therefore form nearly 2 districts for the choice of federal representatives. It forms, however, but one county, in which every elector votes for each of its representatives in the state legislature. And what may appear to be still more counties of the state, are not these facts the most satisfactory proofs of fallacy which have been employed against the branch of the federal government under consideration? Has it appeared on trial that the senators of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, or the executive councils of Pennsylvania, or the members of the Assembly of the last states, have betrayed any particular disposition to sacrifice that many to the few, or in any aspect or any respect less worthy of their places than the representatives and magistrates appointed in other states by very small divisions of the people? But there are cases of stronger complexion than which I have yet quoted. One branch of the legislature of Connecticut is so constituted that each member is elected by the whole state. So the governor of that state, of Massachusetts and this state, and president of New Hampshire, I have every man to decide whether the result of any one of these 3 experiments can be said the countenance of suspicion, that the diffuse mode of choosing representatives of the people tends to elevate traitors and undermine the public liberty. All right, so all these people complaining about the size of House of Representatives, he gives examples of the states, like, look, they have the same or worse ratios in their state legislatures. So, and they're, those states exist and they're working. All right, let me see how long this one is, see if I need to take a bathroom break. All right, I can do one more before I got to take a bathroom break. 58. Actually, no, I'm going to take a bathroom break now. I'll be right back. All right. Okay. Federalist 58. All right, still on the objection of number of members will not be augmented as the progress of population demands considered. All right, so the remaining charge against the House of Representatives, which I am to examine, is grounded on the supposition that the number of members will not be augmented from time to time, as the progress of population may demand. It has been admitted that this objection is well supported, would have great weight. The following observations will show that, like most other objections against the Constitution, it can only proceed from a partial view of the subject, or from the jealousy which discolors and disfigures every object which is beheld. 1. Those who argue that the objections seem not to have recollected the federal constitution will not suffer by the comparison with state constitutions, in the security provided by a gradual augmentation of the number of representatives. The number which is to prevail in the first instance is declared to be temporary. Its duration is limited to the short term of 3 years. With every successive term of 10 years, a census of inhabitants is to be repeated. The unequivocal objects of these regulations are, first, to readjust from time to time the appointment of representatives to the number of inhabitants, under the single exception that each state shall only have one representative at least. Secondly, to augment the number of representatives at the same periods under the sole limitation that the whole number shall not exceed one for every 30,000 inhabitants. If we review that the constituents of the several states, we shall find that some of them contain no determined regulations on this subject, and that others correspond pretty much on this point of the federal constitution. And that the most effectual security in any of them is resolvable into mere directory provision. 2. As far as the experience has taken place on this subject, a gradual increase of representatives under the state constitutions has at least kept pace with that of the constituents, and it appears that the former have been ready to concur with such measures as the latter have been to call for them. 3. This is particularly the federal constitution which ensures a watchful attention in a majority both of the people and of their representatives to a constitutional augmentation of the latter. The peculiarness lies in this, that one branch of the legislature is representative of the citizen, the other of the states. In the former, consequently, the larger states will have the most weight. In the latter, the advantage will be in the favor of the smaller states, Congress and the Senate, or the House and the Senate. From this circumstance, it may be certainly be inferred that the larger states will be strenuous advocates for increasing the number of weights that part of the legislature in which their influence predominates. And it so happens that four only of the largest will have a majority of the whole votes in the House of Representatives. Should the representatives or people, therefore, of the smaller states oppose at any time a reasonable addition of members, a coalition of a very few states will be sufficient to overrule the opposition, a coalition which, notwithstanding the rivalship of local prejudices which might prevent it in ordinary occasions, would not fail to take place, and not merely prompted by common interest, but justified by equality and principles of the Constitution. It may be alleged, perhaps, that the Senate would be prompted by like motives to an adverse coalition, and their concurrence would be indispensable, and that the constitutional views of the other branches might be defeated. This is the difficulty which has probably created the most serious apprehensions in the jealous friends of the numerous representation. Fortunately, it is among the difficulties which existed only in appearance. Vanish on a close and accurate inspection. The following reflections will, if I mistake not, be admitted to conclusive and satisfactory on this point. Notwithstanding the equal authority which will subsist between the two houses on legislative subjects, except the orienting of money bills, it cannot be doubted that the House, composed of the greater number of members, when supported by the more powerful states, and speaking the known and determined sense of the majority of the people, will have no small advantage in the question depending on the comparative firmness of the two houses. This one's Madison. He loves these run-on sentences. This advantage must be increased by the consciousness felt by the same side being supported in its demands by right, by reason, and by the Constitution, and the consciousness on the opposite side of contending against the force of the solemn considerations. It is farther to be considered that the gradation between the smallest and largest states there are several, which, though most likely in general to arrange themselves among the former, are too little removed in extent and the population from the latter. The second, an opposition to the just and legitimate pretensions. All right, hints. All right, getting to the point. It is by no means certain that the majority of votes, even in the Senate, would be unfriendly to proper augmentations in the number of representatives. It will not be looking too far to add that the senators from all the states may be gained over the just views of the House of Representatives by an expedient too obvious to be overlooked, as these states will, for a great length of time, advance in population with peculiar rapidity, that they will be interested in frequent reappointments of the representatives of the number of inhabitants. The large states, therefore, who will prevail in the House of Representatives will have nothing to do but make appropriaments. I can't say that word. Shuffle reappointments and augmentations mutually conditions with each other, and the senators from all the most growing states will be bound to contend for the latter. But the interest which the states will feel in the former, these considerations seem to afford ample security on the subject, ought alone satisfy all doubts and fears which have been indulged with regard to it, admitting, however, that there should be insufficient to subdue the unjust policy of the smaller states or the predominant influence in councils of the Senate. A constitutional and infallible resource still remains with the larger states, by which they will be able at all times to accomplish their just purposes. The House of Representatives can not only refuse, but they alone can propose the supplies requisite for the support of government. They, in a word, hold the purse, that powerful instruments by which we behold. In the history of the British Constitution, an infant and humble representation of the people gradually enlarged by the sphere of activity and importance, and finally reducing, as far as it seems to have wished, all the overgrown prerogatives of the other branches of government. The power over the purse may in fact be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon which the Constitution can arm the immediate representative of the people for obtaining the redress of every grievance. This was a big sticking point, that the House of Representatives had the power of the purse. This was hugely important to all the framers, and it's not cool when Congress just gives away this power to the president. It is not constitutional. And for carrying it into every effect the just and salutary measure. But will not the House of Representatives be as much interested in the Senate in maintaining the government in its proper functions? And will they not therefore be unwilling to stake its existence or its reputation on the pliancy of the Senate? Or if such a trial of firmness between the two branches were hazardous, would not one as likely the first to yield to the other? These questions will create no difficulty with those who reflect that in all cases the smaller the number, the more permanent and conspicuous the station of men in power, the stronger must be the interest which will individually feel whatever concerns of the government. Those who represent the dignity of the country in affairs, those whose causes are to ascribe the continual triumph of the British House of Commons over the other branches of the government whenever the engine of money bill has to be employed. An absolute inflexibility on the side of the latter, although it could not have failed to involve every department of the state in the general confusion, has neither been apprehended nor experienced. The utmost degree of firmness that can be displayed by the federal Senate or President will not be more than equal to the resistance in which they have supported the Constitution and patriotic principles. Oh, that's rough. In the review of the Constitution of the House of Representatives, I have passed over circumstances of economy which the present state of affairs might have had some effect in lessening the temporary number of representatives, and a disregard of those who would probably have as rich a theme of declamation against the Constitution as has been shown by the smallness of the number proposed. I admit any remarks on the difficulty which might be found, under the present circumstances, in engaging with the federal service a large number of such characters as the people will probably elect. One observation, however, I must be permitted to add on this subject as claiming, in my judgment, a very serious attention. It is that in all legislative assemblies, the greater number composing them may be the fewer that will be the men who will in fact direct their proceedings. In the first place, the numerous an assembly may be of whatever characters composed, the greater is known to be the ascendancy of passion over reason. In the next place, the larger number, the greater will be the proportion of members' limited information and of weak capacities. Now it is precisely on the characters of description that the eloquence of the address are few to known to act by all the force. Okay, so if you have a lot of representatives, each one is going to be a lot weaker in their capacities, and they're going to just know less. In the ancient republics, where the whole body of the people assembled in person, a single orator or an artful statesman was generally seen to rule with as complete a sway as the scepter has been placed in a single hand. On the same principle, the more multitudinous a representative assembly may be rendered, the more it partake in the infirmities incidents to collect the meetings of the people. Ignorance will be the dupe of cunning, and passion the slave of sophistry and declamation. The people can never err more than in supposing that the multiplying their representative beyond the certain limit, they strengthen the barrier against the government of the few. Experience will forever admonish them, on the contrary, after securing a sufficient number for the purposes of safety, of local information, and diffuse sympathies with the whole society. They will counteract with their own views by every addition to their representatives. The countenance of government may become more democratic, but the soul animates it will be more oligarchic. The machine will be enlarged, but the fewer and often the more secret will be the springs by which the motions are directed, as connected with the objection against the number of representatives. May properly be here noticed that which has been suggested against the number of competent and legislative businesses. It has been said that more than a majority ought to have been required for a quorum, and in particular cases, if not all, more than a majority of a quorum for a decision. That the some advantages might have resulted in such a precaution cannot be denied. It might have been an additional shield of some particular interest, and another obstacle generally to hasty partial measures. But these considerations are outweighed by the inconveniences in an opposite scale. In all cases where justice or the general good might require new laws to be passed or an active measure to be pursued, the fundamental principle of free government would be reversed. Siren. It would no longer the majority would rule. The power would be transferred to the minority. Were the defense privilege limited, in particular cases, an interested minority might take advantage of it to screen themselves from equitable sacrifice to the general weal, W-E-A-L, wheel, or in particular, the emergencies to extort unreasonable indulgences. Lastly, it would facilitate and foster the baneful practice of secessions, a practice which shown itself even in states where the majority is only required, a practice subversive of all principles in order to regular government, a practice which leads more directly to public convulsions and to the ruin of public government than any other which has been displayed among us. Ugh, God, that one was weird. Madison gets me. He like trips me up because he does these long run-on sentences and he doesn't break his paragraphs up, so he makes it really hard to read. Hamilton does it too, but oh yeah, I was about to say Hamilton does it less, and then the Hamilton's coming up, and it's just one giant long paragraph. Spoke too soon. Damn you, Hamilton. Concerning the power of Congress to regulate the election of members. New York packet, so he's still trying to get to the people of New York. Alexander Hamilton, February 22nd, 1788. Okay, actually, that brings me right. When did New York ratify the Constitution? July 22nd. July 26th, 1788. So, I guess this is working because the New York is only 2 months away from ratifying it. The natural order of the subject leads us to consider, in this place, that the provision of the Constitution which authorizes the national legislature to regulate, in the last resort, the election of its own members. It is these words, the times, the place, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature. Therefore, this must have been really frustrating. Apparently, he's getting a lot of pushback that, that Congress is just going to pick how the elections work. And he's like, no, actually read the Constitution. The time, he's putting in all caps. He's getting real mad. The time, the place, the manner is the state legislators, not the federal government. He's getting real mad. You can when Hamilton goes in all caps, he's like, I'm tired of hearing about this. You're wrong. All right. The Congress may, at any time, by law, make an alter to such regulations, except as a places of choosing of senators. The provision has not only been declaimed against those who condemn the Constitution in the gross, but it has been censured by those who have objected with less latitude and the greater moderation. And in one instance, it has thought to be exceptional by gentlemen who have declared himself an advocate of every part of the system. I am greatly mistaken, notwithstanding, if there be any article in the whole plan more completely defensible than this, it is properly rest upon the evidence in plain proportion that, all caps, every government ought to contain itself the means of its own preservation. Every just reader will, at first sight, approve an adherence to this rule, and in the work of the convention, it will disprove every deviation from it, which may not appear to have been dictated by the necessity of incorporating into work some particular ingredient, with which a rigid conformity to the rule was incompatible. Even in this case, though he may acquiesce in its necessity, yet he will not cease to regard and regret a departure from such a fundamental principle as a proportion of imperfection in the system which may prove to seed of future weakness, and perhaps anarchy. It will not be alleged that the election law could have been framed and inserted in the Constitution, which would have been always applicable in every probable change to the situation of the country, and it will therefore not be denied that a discretionary power over the elections ought to exist somewhere. It will, I presume, be as readily conceded that there were only 3 ways in which the power could have been reasonably modified and disposed, that it must either have been lodged wholly in the national legislature, or wholly in the state legislatures, or primary in the latter and ultimately in the former. The last mode has, with reason, been prefaced by this convention. They have submitted the regulation of elections for federal government in the first instance to the local administrations, which in ordinary cases, when no improper views prevail, may be both more convenient and more satisfactory. But they have reserved to the national authority a right to interpose, whether extraordinary circumstances might render that imposition necessary to its safety. Nothing can be more evident than an exclusive power of regulating elections for the federal government in the hands of state legislatures would have the existence of the Union entirely at their mercy. They could at any moment annihilate it by neglecting to provide for the choice of persons to administer its affairs. It is too little without the equivalent for the risk in an unanswerable objections, nor has any satisfactory reason yet been assigned for the incurring that risk. The extravagant surmises of a distempered jealousy can never be dignified with that character. If we are in a humor to presume the abuse of power, it is fair to presume them on the part of the state governments as on part of the general government. and as it is more consonant, all right.
Consonant.
Oh my God, I am a moron. It's more consonant to the rules of just a theory than to trust the Union with the care of its own existence, than to transfer that care to any other hands. If abuses of power are to be hazarded on the side of the other, it is more rational to hazard them where the power would naturally be placed than where it would unnaturally be placed. Suppose an article had been introduced into the Constitution empowering the United States to regulate the elections for the particular states. Would any man have hesitated to condemn it, both as unwarranted transposition of power and premeditated engine for the destruction of state governments? The violation of principle in this case would have required no comment, and to an unbiased observer, it will not be less apparent to the project of subjecting the existence of the national government in this similar respect to the pleasure of the state governments. What do you have? Oh, you got the toy. That's okay. An impartial view of this matter cannot fail to result in a conviction that each, as far as possible, ought to depend on itself for its own preservation. As an objection to this position, it may be remarked that the constitution of the National Senate would involve, in its full extent, the danger which it is suggested might flow from the exclusive power in the state legislatures to regulate the federal elections. It may be alleged that, declining the appointments of senators, they might at a time give a fatal blow to the Union, and from this it may be inferred that its existence would thus be rendered dependent upon in so essential a point, there can be no objection to entrusting them with the particular case under consideration. The interest of each state, it may be added, to maintain its representation in the national councils, would be a complete security against the abuse of this trust. This argument, though specious, will not, upon examination, be found solid. It is certainly true that the state legislatures, by forbearing their appointments of senators, may destroy the national government, but it will not follow that because they have a power to do this in one instance, they ought to have it in every other. There are cases in the pernicious tendency of such power may be far more decisive, without any motive equally cogent with that which must be regulated to the conduct of convention in the respect of the formation of the Senate, to recommend their admission into the system. Why does it make me do this every single time? Okay. So far, that construction may expose the Union to the possibility of injury to the state legislatures. It is an evil, but is an evil which could not have been avoided without the excluding the states in their political capacities wholly from the place of organization of the national government. It has been done. It would have doubtless have been interpreted into the entire dereliction of the federal principles, and would certainly have been deprived of the state governments of the absolute safeguard which would they enjoy under the provision. But however wise it may have been, submitted to this instance of inconvenience for the attainment of necessary advantage of the greater good, no interference can be drawn from thence to favor the accumulation of the evil, where no necessary urges nor the greater good invites. All right. It may be easily discerned also that the national government would run a much greater risk from the power in the state legislatures over the elections of the House of Representatives than from the power of appointing the members of the Senate. The senators are to be chosen for the period of 6 years. There is to be a rotation by which the seats of a third part of them are to be vacated and replenished every 2 years. and no state is to be entitled to more than 2 senators. A quorum of the body is to consist of 16 members. So there was 26 senators at the time. So 16 of them had to be there to actually do anything. The joint results of these circumstances would be that the temporary combination of a few states to intermit the appointment of senators could neither annually annul the existence nor impair the activity of the body, and it is from a great general and permanent combination of the states that we can have anything to fear. The first might proceed from the sinister designs in the leading members of a few of the state legislatures. The last would suppose a fixed and rooted disaffection in the great body of the people, which will either never exist at all, or will, in probability, proceed from the experience of the ineptitude of the general government to the advancement of their happiness, in which no good citizen could desire its continuance. But with regard to the Federal House of Representatives, there is intended to be a general election of members once in 2 years. If the state legislatures were to be invested with the exclusive power of regulating these elections, every period of making them would be a delicate crisis in the national situation, which might issue in a dissolution of the Union. If the leaders of a few of the most important states should have entered into a previous conspiracy to prevent an election, I shall not deny that there is a degree of weight in this observation. In the interest of each state to be representative in the federal councils will be security against the abuse of power over the elections in the hand of the state legislatures. But the security will not be considered complete by those who attend to the force of this obvious distinction between the interest of the people and the public felicity, and in the interest of local rulers in the power and consciousness of their offices. The people of America may be warmly attached to the government of the Union at times when the particular rulers of the particular states, stimulated by the natural rivalship of power and by the hopes of personal I cannot say that word. Okay, I need to have Google pronounce it for me so I can say it.
Speech modification is meant
Grised. I still can't say it, even when I heard it. And supported by a strong faction, each of those states may be in very poor opposite temper. The diversity of sentiment between the majority of the people and the individuals who have the greatest credit in their councils. It is exemplified in some of the states at the present moment on the present question. The scheme of separate confederacies, which will always multiply the chances of ambition, will be a never-failing bait to all such influential characters of the state administrations as are capable of preferring their own annulment and advancement to the public weal. When so effectual a weapon in their hands as to be the exclusive power of regulating elections for the national government, a combination of a few such men in a few of the most considerable states where the temptation will always be the strongest might accomplish the destruction of the Union by seizing the opportunity of some casual dissatisfaction among the people, and which perhaps they may themselves have excited, to discontinue the choice of members for the Federal House of Representatives. It ought never to be forgotten that a firm union in this country under an efficient government will probably be an increasing object of jealousy to more than one nation of Europe, and that enterprises to subvert it will sometimes originate in the intrigues of foreign powers. Good call, Hamilton, and will seldom fail to be patronized by the abatement of some of them. Its preservation, therefore, ought to have no case than to be avoided, and committed to the guardianship of any of those situations will uniformly beget the immediate interest in the faithful and vigilant performance of trust. Publius. All right. One more. And we'll end on an even 60. One more. Hamilton. Oh, he's back to paragraphs. Thank God. No more run-on sentences. All right, we got this. One more. The same subject continued. Concerning the power of Congress to regulate the elections of members. Federalist number 60, February 26, 1788. So we're 2 months away from ratification. We have seen the uncontrollable power over the elections of the federal government could not, without hazard, be committed to the state legislatures. Let us now see what would be the danger on the other side, that is, from confiding the ultimate right of regulation to the own elections to the Union itself. It is not pretended that this right would ever be used by the exclusion of the state form to share it in its representation. The interest of all would, in this respect at least, be the security of all. But it is alleged that it might be employed in such a manner as to promote the election of some favorable class of men in exclusion of others, by confiding the places of election to particular districts and rendering it impracticable for the citizens at large to partake in the choice. Of all chimerical suppositions, this seems to be the most chimerical. On one hand, no rational calculation of the probabilities would lead us to imagine that the disposition which a conduct so violent and extraordinary would imply could ever find its way into the national councils, and on the other hand, it may be concluded with certainty that if so improper a spirit should gain admittance into them, it would display itself a form altogether different and far more decisive. An improbability of the attempt may be satisfactorily inferred by the single reflection that it could be made without causing the immediate revolt of the great body of the people, headed and directed by the state governments. It is not difficult to conceive that this characteristic right of freedom may, in certain turbulent and fractious seasons, be violated, in respect to a particular class of citizens, by a victorious and overbearing majority, but that so fundamental a privilege in a country so situated and enlightened should be invaded by the prejudice of the great mass of people, by the deliberate policy of the government, without occasioning a popular revolution. It is altogether inconceivable and incredible. All right. In addition to in this general reflection, there are considerations of a far more precise nature, which forbid all apprehension on the subject. The dissimilarity in the ingredients which will compose the national government, and in some more in the manner in which they will be brought into action in its various branches, must form a powerful obstacle in the concert of views in any particular scheme of elections. There is sufficient diversity in the state of property, in the genius, manners, and habits of the people of different parts of the Union, to occasion a material diversity of disposition in their representatives towards different ranks and conditions in society. And though an intimate... Man, you gotta get me demonetized, Hamilton. In an intimate relation under the same government will promote a gradual assimilation in some of these respects, yet their causes, as well as physical and moral, which may in greater or less degree permanently nourish different propensities and inclinations in this respect. But the circumstance which will be likely to have greatest influence in the matter will be the dissimilar modes of constituting the several component parts of government. The House of Representatives being to be elected immediately by the people, the Senate by the state legislatures, the President by the electors chosen for that purpose by the people, there would be little probability of common interest to submit these different branches in a predilection of any particular class of electors. As to the Senate, it is impossible that any regulation of time and manner which it is at all proposed to be submitted to the national government in the respect to that body, can affect the spirit which will direct the choice of its members. The collective sense of the state legislatures can never be influenced by extraneous circumstances of that sort. A consideration which ought to be which alone ought to satisfy us with the discrimination apprehended would never be attempted. For what inducement could the Senate have to concur with the preface in which it would not be included? Or to what purpose would it be established in reference to one branch of the legislature, if it could be extended to the other? The composition of one, in this case, is a counteract that of the other, that we can never suppose that it would embrace the appointments to the Senate unless we can at the same time suppose the voluntary cooperation of the state legislatures. If we were to make the later supposition, it then becomes immaterial where the power in question is to be placed in the hands of those in the Union. But what is to be the object of the capricious partiality in the national councils? Is it to be exercised in a discrimination between the different departments of industry, or between the different kinds of property, or between the different degrees of property? Will it lean in favor of the landed interest, or the moneyed interest, or the mercantile interest, or the manufacturing interest? Or, to speak in the fashionable language of the adversaries of the Constitution, will it court the elevation of the wealthy and well-born to the exclusion and debasement of the rest of society? If this partially is to be exerted in favor of those who concerned in any particular description of industry or property, I presume it will readily be admitted that the competition for it lie between landed men and merchants, and I scruple not to affirm that it is infinitely less likely that either of them should gain an ascendant in the national councils, that one or the other of them should predominate in the local councils. The interference will be that a conduct tending to give undue preference to either is much less dreaded from the former than the latter. Thus several states in various degrees addicted to the agriculture and commerce. In most, if not all of them, agriculture is predominant. In very few of them, however, commerce nearly divides its empire. And in most of them, a considerable share of influence, in the proportion as either prevails, it will be conveyed in the national representation, and for the very reason that this will be a emanation from a greater variety of interest, and I'm losing it, and in much more various propositions than will be found in any single state. It will be much less apt to espouse either of them with a decided partiality with the representative English state. Okay. Hamilton loves his counterbalances of power. He's like, it's everywhere. We got merchants fighting industry, and we have industry counterbalancing agriculture, and we have agriculture counterbalancing this. In contrary, consisting chiefly on the cultivators of land, or the rules of equal representation obtain, the landed interest must upon the whole predominate in the government. As long as this interest prevails in most of the state legislatures, so long it must maintain a correspondent superiority in the national senate, which will generally be a faithful copy of the majority of those assemblies. It cannot therefore be presumed that a sacrifice of the landed to the mercantile class will ever be a favorable object to this branch of federal legislature. In applying thus, particularly to the Senate, a general observation suggested by the situation of the country, I am governed by this consideration, that the credulous votaries of state power cannot, upon their own principles, suspect that the state legislatures would be warped from their duty by any external influence. But in reality, the same situation must have the same effect, in the primitive composition, at least in the Federal House of Representatives. A load of French baloney. Judging by the grammar, it seems to be a genuine colonial document. Yeah, we're reading the Federalist Papers. It was not sourced in France. It was in the House of Representatives, or it was in the colonial America, not France. Sorry, I just saw your message. I was not paying attention. In order, perhaps, to give a continuance in the ejection of any rate, it may be asked, there is not danger in the opposite bias in the national government, which may dispose it to endeavor to secure the monopoly of federal administration in the landed class, as there is little likelihood that the supposition of such a basis would have any terrors for those who would immediately be injured by it. A labored answer to this question will be dispensed with. It will be sufficient to remark first that the reasons elsewhere assigned it will be less likely any decided particularly should prevail in the councils of union than those in any of its members. Secondly, that there would be no temptation to violate the Constitution in favor of the landed classes, because that class would, in the natural course of things, enjoy a great preponderance as itself could desire. And thirdly, men accustomed to investigate the sources of public prosperity upon a large scale must be well convinced that the utility of commerce is to be inclined to inflict upon a deep wound, as it would result from an entire exclusion of those that would best understand its interest from a share of management to them. The importance of commerce in the view of revenue alone must effectually guard it against the enmity of a body which would continually be impounded in its favor by the urgent cause of public necessity. I the rather consult brevity in discussing the probability of preference founded upon this discrimination between different kinds of industry and property, because as far as I understand the meaning of these objectors, they contemplate a discrimination of another kind. They appear to have in view as the objects of the preference with which they endeavor to alarm us those whom they designate by the description the wealthy and the well-born. These, it seems, are to be exalted by an odious preeminence over the rest of their fellow citizens. At one time, however, their elevation is to be necessary consequence of the smallness and representative body. At another time, it is to be effected by depriving the people at large of opportunity, exercising their right of suffrage and choice of the body. But upon what principle is this discrimination of the places elected to be made in order to answer this purpose of meditated preference? Are the wealthy and well-born, as they are so called, confined to particular spots in the several states? Have they by some miraculous instinct or foresight set apart each of them in common places of residence? Are they only to be met with in the towns or cities? Or are they, on the contrary, scattered over the face of the country, as avarice or chance may have happened to cast their own lot of their predecessors? If the latter is the case, as every intelligent man knows it to be, quote in parentheses, it is not evident that the policy of confining the places of election to particular districts would be as subversive of its own aim as it would be exceptional on every other account. The truth is that there is no method of securing the rich and preference apprehended by the prescribing qualifications of property either of it who may elect or be elected. But this forms no part of the power to be conferred upon the national government. Its authority would be expressly restricted to the regulation and time, the place, and manner of the elections. The qualifications of purpose who may choose or be chosen, has been remarked upon on other occasions, are defined and fixed in the Constitution and are unalterable by the legislation. Okay, so the Constitution says who can be representative, who can elect them, but the states have the time, places, and manner. He puts this in all caps to make it very, very clear.
Let it, however, be admitted, for argument's sake, that the expedient suggested might be successful, and let it at the same time equally be taken for granted that all the scruples by which the sense of duty or the apprehension of danger of the experiment might inspire, we are overcome in the chest with the national rulers. Still, I imagine it will hardly be pretended that they could ever hope to carry such an enterprise into exclusion without the aid of military force sufficient to subdue the residents of the great body of the people. The improbability of existence of force equal to that object has been discussed and demonstrated in the different parts of these papers, but that the futility of the objection under consideration may appear to be the strongest light. It shall be conceded for a moment that such a force might exist, that the national government shall be supposed to be the actual possession of it. What will be the conclusion? With what disposition to invade the essential rights of the community, and with what means of gratifying that disposition? It is presumed that the persons who were actuated by it would amuse themselves in the ridiculous task of fabricating election laws for securing a preference to a favorable class of men. Would they not be likely to prefer a conduct better adapted to their election laws for securing preference to the favorable class of men? Would they not be likely to prefer a conduct better adapted to their own immediate that word again, I can't fucking say it. Aggrandizement. Let's go with that. It's close enough. Would they not rather boldly resolve to perpetuate themselves in office by one decisive act of usurpation than to trust the precarious expedient which, despite of all precautions they might accompany them, might terminate in the dismission, disgrace, or ruin of their authors? Would they not fear that the citizens, not less tenacious than conscious of their rights, would flock to the remote extremes of their respective states, to the places of election, to overthrow their tyrants, and substitute men for whom they be disposed to avenge the violated majority of the people? Publius. All right. We're getting close to the end. That's 60 done out of 85. But I'm done for the night. We'll do 61 through 65 next week, unless I can slip in here later on this week. Do it again. I hope everyone has a good night. Throw a like if you got anything out of this. Throw a follow if you want to hit up this next week and get more through the Federalist Papers, learn what they were writing the Constitution about, how they were defending it, how they liked it. I hope everyone has a good night.